Perhaps one of the most UX things about UI is how we define our primary and secondary colors, and sometimes tertiary, even though I really never use that word, it just kind of goes along with the title. But if you think about common primary actions, we're typically making forward progress. Think sign up, sign in, save, post, things like that, things that are kind of creating or making forward progress. Whereas secondary actions are more like cancel or edit or skip or filter or go back or close, things like that. They're not necessarily usually making forward progress. Now there's going to be some instances where a secondary action might make forward progress, but all in all, primary and secondary have a pretty clear distinction. I just want to jump straight into a couple of examples from big name sites that are out there, as well as cover a few primary, secondary color scheme examples and some of my own personal work. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is this Airbnb example. Now you can see on their website here, they've got this warm pinkish red as their kind of main brand color. And then if I go to actual Airbnb.com, you can see that brand color is showing up in their primary call to action right here for search. And again, they're using the white version of the logo and a giant picture. But first of all, I just want to point out the fact that look how incredibly simple this is, and look how much that search button stands out. I think this is one of the best examples of passing the squint test. If you zoom out of the frame of the website and you kind of squint your eyes so everything's fuzzy, can you still make out where the primary call to action is? Now, you don't always have to do the squint test, but this is a great way to just understand whether or not your primary action is calling enough attention. So right here, if we want to go, let's say we want to take a vacation to Costa Rica, we're going to leave March 1st, come back on the 7th, and don't think I'm going to take my kids this time. So primary call to action is the brand color here. Okay, now we have the brand color back into the logo, and there's not a primary action on the screen. And the reason for that is because this is more of an exploratory screen. So there's not going to be one single call to action. All right, let's choose this one because the pool looks nice. All right, so we're back here again. And now we can see the main call to action coming back in. But notice on this page, the only thing the same color is the logo. And, this is kind of one of the examples where you can use the primary color as the primary brand color and the primary call to action. Sometimes those two things can compete, but all in all, most of the time it's going to be okay to use that primary color as the brand color. However, if it said Airbnb really big and the logo was more full and it was really a lot of that color, it wouldn't really work. But because there's not really anything else, especially when you scroll down, this is the only color on the screen. And if you zoom out here, it still passes the squint test. And they're bringing in their secondary color, this kind of green, it's not a full green, but if you think about the color wheel, red and green are opposite spectrum. So that means they're complementary colors. So red and green, if you use it at full saturation, it's going to look like Christmas. But if you kind of mute them the way that they've done here, it's kind of a nice combination. And so anytime you have opposite colors opposite the color wheel, it's going to be kind of a complementary, and they're literally called complementary colors. So we can see this green color coming in for some of the links. And I would start to call this the secondary color. Whereas we have some secondary buttons up here, but these are almost more like tertiary, or just kind of, they're more like quick action buttons. They're just kind of functional to do like a different view or to share the photo. It's not really quite the full, it's not really a full big action the same way that reserve this place would be. You can tell that these are styled differently than even the one here. These filters, it's still kind of the same background color. Because these are on a photo, they've chosen to not use the border. And technically they probably could have used this same exact style for the filters, but it's pretty common to put these filters in a pill shape, so I can understand why they did that. And so if we go to reserve, let's see what happens here. Okay, I'm not logged in, but you can see even here, they're bringing in their primary call to action again with that brand color, and then they're using log in as that kind of secondary color. So you kind of get the idea of primary, secondary from, and Airbnb is a huge company. They have a huge team of professional designers working on this, thinking about these things. So whenever you have questions about things like this, it's always good to reference big tech companies that have a lot of designers working on this. Okay, next up, I want to point out something you might not have noticed on google.com. So I've got an incognito browser here, so I'm not logged in, just for the simple fact that you can see this sign in button and you've got your search. It's very simple. Most of the time you might not even use google.com because you use the search bar, in your browser. But I do want to point this out. You would think that the call to action, the primary call to action would be search here. So you would think that Google search would be the primary. But right now they have elevated sign in as a bigger priority than actually doing the search. Because most of the time I'm just going to hit the return key to actually perform my search. So, sign in is still the primary call to action here. And as I scroll down, they're really wanting me to sign in because Google likes to track your data. But what's interesting though, is if I open the inspector and reload the page, there's not an easy return key on mobile. I mean, there is the search button, but all in all, you can't just quickly type it in and hit return. So they're actually reversing the priority of sign in and search. Because on mobile, I think they're more aware that people just want to search really quickly. So they're making a decision to elevate search as their main priority. And they're also trying to get you to use the app. So if you hit no thanks, you can see on this screen, we've got sign in as a secondary call to action. And now this is the blue call to action. And it's just kind of interesting that they're changing that. Here's a larger version of the mobile view. But then when I go to desktop view, sign in is the primary call to action. But either way, no matter what someone decides about what's primary, whether it's the search button or the sign in button, you can tell it's still styled the same way. It's the same blue, the same gradient, and whether it's text or an icon, it is white. It's got this very subtle little drop shadow. Okay, so now I want to pull up one of my client projects. This is the My Monero app again. And I just want to point out the primary calls to action here. So on the very first page here, you can't really do anything unless you log into a wallet or you create a new wallet. And so this is my primary call to action and this is my secondary call to action. And it's just this one in particular is very subtle, just a light gray that makes it pop off of the background just a little bit. But if you do the squint test on this one again, you can just see this giant color of blue in the bottom right. I'm using the brand color or kind of the primary color for the app, which is this blue, in 4 different places here. So this is the active icon color. And I'm also using that primary color as the selection and as the next button. And also I'm using it as a potential wallet color because you can choose your wallet, choose the color that you want it to show up. And we don't even need them to fill out any information. We're not going to require that because it's just for that person's reference. You can see that it's going to be called Monero Wallet, or they can type in something if they want to. And next is highlighted because it's the primary call to action. So if you do the squint test here, it's not quite as obvious because I've got the blue here and the blue here. It's kind of a consistent pattern to have cancel and next at the top. It's a little bit more forgiving if you use that same color in multiple different places. But we're also not putting a blue button with black text anywhere else on this entire screen. This is the only place that you see it. So when you go here, there is no primary action because you haven't agreed to the terms yet. And once you've agreed, then we pop in that bright blue again. And we're just reusing it over and over. Every screen, the same blue button all the way through. And then for when you have wallets, the same blue button, the same primary location. So we've got color and location and style are all the same for the same primary button. And it's not quite as important on this particular screen because you have multiple options. You can go into your wallet or you can navigate somewhere else. So it's not as critical as a screen like this. A screen like this, you can see we've reduced the opacity of the sidebar because we really want to elevate, this is absolutely critically required. Create a new wallet or use existing because you cannot do anything unless you do one of these 2 actions. Whereas on this screen, we're using the same style, but we're not quite as concerned about the overusage of the primary color. We're still concerned about it, but it's just not a huge deal that we avoid that blue at all costs, because we can use the blue for some active states as long as it's not clashing quite as much. And then here you can see I'm inside the wallet, and there's not really a big primary call to action here because you're just checking your balance. You might check out your transactions. You can edit the name or the color of your wallet, but nothing is there's no primary action because it's just kind of like a tool to view this information. But once you go into some of these other screens, like send the money, and you can see our send button is ghosted here. And once you finally enter in all this information, then if you do the squint test on this screen, primary action, same as before, the same position, same consistency, position and color is exactly the same. We're ready to make forward progress with this primary action. And then we have our secondary buttons with that same gray elevated background. This is the same position and the same styling as the secondary actions on this screen, use existing wallet. The only addition are these icons, so you can kind of help, add a little bit of flavor to the buttons to make it look good. So we can use our camera, or we can choose a file that we can load into the screen. But overall, the primary action is the send button here. And one other thing I want to point out too is, we've chosen our primary color, so it kind of makes sense to use that as the active states for these icons. All right, so you can see on this screen, we have a primary call to action of download, but you could imagine, grab that button, gonna paste it here. Imagine that this said copy, okay. All right, so check that out. All of a sudden, we have completely ruined our hierarchy because copy is not a primary call to action. I mean, it could be. If copy was your primary action, then download needs to be something else. But you really don't, if you're gonna have multiple actions on one screen, chances are it's not a primary. And not even chances, like if you have multiple actions on the same screen, more than likely that needs to be more of like a secondary color. Primary actions are reserved for one primary action. You might have a sign up button in the top header and like a get started now in the same slightly different style or something like that, but it's the same action. It's performing the same action. But this one would not be performing the same action. This one would be copying the request link. This one would be copying the message. So this is definitely not something that we want to do for our primary call to action. If we compare that with the marketing site and the landing page for this app, you can tell that if you're gonna make a marketing site for your app, and your app has primary calls to action like these blue colors, you could possibly get away with making the primary calls to action on your website blue, but sometimes that can start to compete pretty heavily, especially like, look at this big blue here. You could imagine if I did a gray background or something, I don't want to have to change everything. But if I did something like this, and then this was black, I could possibly get that to work, but you can already tell if the squint test is going to fail here because I've got this huge block of blue, and it's just also my colors are kind of muddy, so this wouldn't work for a number of reasons. But specifically for the primary call to action reason, this is just not gonna work. So if I go back here, now the squint test doesn't quite work on this as well, because if I squint my eyes, I'm drawn to the blue, and I'm also overwhelmed with the yellow. Also, blue and yellow are complementary colors as well. Actually more like blue and orange. If you look at the color wheel, blue and orange are gonna be opposite, but if you cheat over just a little bit, you'll have blue and yellow. So they're complementary colors. So that's why I chose the yellow for this background, because I knew it would kind of complement the blue color. But I can't really use the blue and the yellow together. They're not gonna work very well. So even though these are complementary colors, for a call to action like this, it just kind of vibrates too hard, and it's just, if you look at that, it's just like it doesn't look good. I'm choosing basically this black color from the app as the primary call to action. And the reason it's working is because it's on this yellow background. So if I had the background be more like a gray and all this text was white, that wouldn't work quite as well. It actually still kind of works because the yellow emoji pointing down kind of draws my attention. It looks okay. but it doesn't have the same effect that this big yellow piece has when that is the background. And then the download button really stands off because it's just got that nice contrast because it has that surrounding color that just gives it a little bit more pop. I chose the black and the yellow because I knew that would kind of support the colors of the app. So I'm trying to support that blue color without kind of taking away from it. And then down here, this passes the squint test because download is the only thing that's really big and dark and has that kind of action that's calling your attention. Okay, so if we look back at this Google example on an authenticated page, and I go somewhere like this and I hit manage my Google account, you can see again, there's not a primary call to action on this page because everything it's more of an exploratory. There's no extreme forward driving action. However, they are still using the primary color for get started, manage your personal data, all of this stuff. And also notice that the active state on the tab is a blue color. And they're reusing the background color for these rollovers, and they're reusing the background color for these rollovers. So there's really only a few different colors that are being used here. So I've brought some of these screenshots into Figma here because I want to point out something pretty interesting. So Google's primary color is this little blue. It's actually a slight gradient. I drew a square or a rectangle here, and I just chose this color. You can see that if you look really closely, it's this color at the top, but then it kind of goes to a gradient down at the bottom. I'm going to ignore the fact that this is a gradient for now because I want to point something else out. You can see here on that account page that I showed you, this tab, these are actually the flat blue colors. I've got this color here. I just drew a rectangle, snag that blue, and then I'm going to make a copy of that and then snag this blue hex code right here. And then what I want to show you, actually, let me grab this. One really easy way to come up with a secondary color is just grab your primary hex code and just make it 10%. You can tell that's exactly what has been done here. This 10% of the primary color is exactly the same as the hex code. And I don't know necessarily if they made this 10% on their website. It might be an actual hex code. Yeah, see, they're using an actual hex code for this background, but I guarantee you that this is how they came up with a hex code. So once you have this primary color at 10%, the way you would get the actual hex code is just draw a new shape and just select that with the selection, and it gives you that hex code. So that's a really easy way to come up with a complementary color. Not a true complementary color, but just another value of that same color that supports it because it's in the same spectrum, same exact hue. It's just reduced in saturation, reduced in brightness, and it's just going to support that color more easily than trying to find a different color from scratch. So this is going to look nice with that blue. And if you check your contrast, it's a strong AA score, which is right where it needs to be. All right, so for homework, for primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, I want you to duplicate this Figma file or take your own screenshots of Google as an unauthenticated view. And what we're gonna do is redesign google.com. It's a pretty simple page. It's just a one search bar in the middle, and rename it if you want to. Make your own search engine name or use a Google if you want. And what I want you to do is choose one primary color. Don't worry about the gradient or anything like that. Just make sure it has an accessibility score of 4.5 or higher. So don't use blue because that's what Google looks like. Try to make it look a little bit different. Any other hue other than blue, you can choose this desktop view or the mobile view or both, whatever you want to do to make it easier for yourself. But whether or not you do the mobile or the desktop, I do want you to have a primary search button as the primary call to action. Let's go ahead and make that our primary call to action. Use the mobile version as the kind of inspiration. I know the desktop doesn't have that, but for this exercise, we want search to be the primary function. Make sure that is a full color, full background, no dainty stroke buttons for this particular button. Use any type of input field style that you want. Keep it very simple overall, but I want you to focus on your color usage. And then for your second color, you're gonna have these little navigation items at the top, similar to the screenshot. You can use their same text items or put your own. And then over there in the top right or somewhere else, have the sign in button. Don't use black or a fully desaturated gray for these items or for the button. try to use a tiny value of that hue color. So for example, if you're going to use a color like this, say you're going to use like, maybe you want to use a purple or pinkish kind of color. So if this is your primary color and your hue is 310, well, make sure that if you use some other text that you also make the hue 310 on this one, and then give it a little bit of saturation, especially for some of your gray, like for your gray color. Just make sure your hue is exactly the same. You can pull the saturation down to like 1 if you want to have more of a gray text, but we want to leave just a touch of that primary color in the gray text, in the background of the sign in button, and maybe even in the border of the input field or the background. And you can play around with the brightness, but for this exercise, I want you to pick one primary hue and make sure that every one of your color choices has a touch of that hue inside of the color. And if you're feeling super into this assignment, duplicate all of your work and then choose a second hue for your secondary button and possibly some of your text. You can try choosing a complementary color on the color wheel. So if you chose red or pink, you might want to try like a greenish, kind of greenish blue, something like that might complement. And then you can try to use 2 different hues for all of your different colors. But either way, make sure you get that first one done, because I think locking in that one hue and seeing the different ways that that particular hue can apply to primary, secondary, tertiary buttons is a big step in kind of fully understanding how to really manipulate color for your interfaces.